You know, you wonder if you're wondering why an RD is doing a presentation on implicit bias. I got to share that when I joined community college workforce development back in 2010, I was asked to do a study, some research on barriers to the CTE pathways in ICT digital media in the community colleges. Why were they not persisting? And I got to tell you, the initial stages of that research was absolutely depressing because it woke me up to the whole impact of systemic racism and its fingers into our college students and their success. So I turned it around. I turned my research around to say what was working. Okay, let's take a look at that. And the findings were just pretty obvious. I mean, the the reason most underrepresented students persist through difficult pathways and curriculums is usually a teacher, or they have some adult role model or influence on their, motivation, support, etc. So I began to do workshops on engaging underrepresented students based on the research that I've done around emotional intelligence as a means to address implicit bias. So it grew, and I gotta say that I'm gonna try to get through this presentation very quickly because these are just some of the slides and materials that I have put together and delivered at tech companies, at flex days, workshops for professional development. So it's a lot. And I will leave this presentation will be available to you. And if you'd like more information, because I stopped at just explaining, my whole intent today is to, just define what implicit and sometimes called unconscious bias, what is its nature, raise your awareness of how pervasive it is and how it influences our decisions and behaviors. And then also hopefully to, bring your attention to its impact on equity. So what is bias? Well, it's a tendency to believe that some people, ideas, etc., are better than others. Now, this is explicit bias. We all know that there's some people that, and we've been exposed to it, that, there is some very obvious bias that people show. But what we want to talk about here is implicit bias, which is the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding and actions and decisions, but in an unconscious manner. In other words, we have no idea, that we're actually being driven by these biases. And, one of the things that we hear a lot about, diversity and inclusion. Well, unconscious bias is that barrier between diversity and equity. We live in one of the most diverse regions of the country, yet we still have equity issues. So why is that? And it really comes down to implicit bias. Why does it matter to student success? Well, as I mentioned to you, what we found in our studies was that, there's a lot of power that counselors and teachers have in influencing our students and their decisions themselves about, do they want to continue? Or do they feel supported? Do they feel welcome? And a lot of times, the interactions that they have with teachers helps, unfortunately, to fulfill self-fulfilling prophecies. For example, some of you probably heard about stereotype threat. Well, a lot of times the environment that a teacher can create in a classroom can make a really big difference between how students perceive their own abilities and their their ability to actually get the work done. And so this actually, these achievement gaps start very early. I'm not going to run through this video because we don't have enough time, but please take a look at it. It's a really interesting, it really takes a look how, how a student, maybe it's a second or third grade, Black male in a classroom that is a little antsy. He drops a pencil and then he's punished for disrupting the class, where a white student of the same, age could do the same thing and not get that punishment. And that has a ripple effect through the whole system. So take a look at this video when you get a chance. We won't do it today due to time reasons, but again, I just want to point out that, before we actually get into this, to the science and really what's behind implicit bias, I have more material on this particular subject, but I want to stay today on talking about what is unconscious bias, what is implicit bias. So first of all, it's a very stealth autopilot mode of thinking and acting. We have no idea that it's working on us. And it really evades our awareness. And a key point here, curiosity. Sometimes even when we become aware that we might have some ways, unconscious ways that we're thinking, we often don't stop and ask, well, why? I mean, it's kind of uncomfortable to go there. But a key thing that I want to make here, point here that I make, is that it is human. We all have unconscious bias, okay? We can't go through the world without it. I mean, that some of them actually work for us, right? But unfortunately, we have those that we think work for us, but mostly they work against us. I'm sure some of you have heard about the Harvard Implicit Project. Got started back in the mid-90s. And a couple of the science, and it's still going on. You can we'll talk a little bit about the test in the next couple of slides. But a couple of the researchers involved with that project wrote this incredible book, and I highly recommend it if you haven't read it or have it. Blind Spot: The Hidden Biases of Good People. And that subtitle is really important, because a lot of people today, and particularly in the conversations we've been having since George Floyd's murder, is that, oh, I'm not a racist, okay? Or I'm colorblind. Well, that's, as soon as a person says that, that's denial. That's actually, you're not wanting to go there. And that's why this subtitle is very important, because these hidden biases are really, good people have these biases, and those are the kind of conversations we need to have. So just a little bit about what the Harvard project found, which was really interesting. When I put this presentation together, over 2 million people had gone online and taken the Harvard Implicit Awareness Test. And so the data is incredible. So some of these findings you can be pretty sure are true. An example is the preference for young is still, youth. We're a youth culture, but that preference is strong all the way through our 60s and 70s. We really have this whole thing about, youth, right? So we're a youth culture. And then one of the interesting things about the women in the workforce, there's a double whammy there, because, implicitly, we want to see women in careers and in advancing in careers. But at the same time, many women have a strong association of females with family over career. So that is pervasive. And the other interesting thing is, younger people are just as likely to display an implicit race bias as older adults. And that was a surprise for me, because you tend to think that, younger people would not have less of a historical perception of people and less experience of seeing a lot of implicit bias, that they would have less. But no, implicit biases around race are not related to age. And then the other interesting thing is that, there were even numbers of Black respondents that showed a pro-white bias. So half of the Black respondents tended to have a pro-white bias. And again, that's a result of living in a white supremacist country. So human biases are adaptive behaviors. We have to go out into the world every day and make decisions about what is safe or not. And much of this has become automatic and unconscious because you have to think about that, we're exposed to 11 million pieces of information at any one time, but our brains can only functionally deal with about 40. Now, those millions of pieces of information are coming through all of our senses, our bodies, our surroundings, that all of that information is bombarding our brain. So it has to figure out, how do I deal with this? Okay. So it puts things in categories. So when an object, an animal, or a person we comes into our sphere, we immediately have to, react to whatever it is that's coming at us, and the brain has to deal with that. And even though we may not be conscious of it, so that fight or flight thing is something that is really strong and impacts our our biases are developed. But when it comes to prejudice, okay, the human mind jumps into categories, which causes that. This quote by Gordon Allport: "The human mind must think with the aid of categories. Once formed, categories are the basis of normal prejudgment. We cannot possibly avoid this process. Orderly living depends upon it." So, I present bias this way to get people to start to feel comfortable with talking about theirs, exploring it, and realizing that it's okay that you feel this way now. Okay, so go into it and realize that it's human, so that you're not, avoiding it, denying it. Here's a thought to think about too. Again, we're going to talk about how we drop people into categories. Now, if someone asked you how you would identify yourself, you would come up with a list. I could say, I'm an African-American woman. I live in the Bay Area. I have I have a terminal degree, and I work in workforce development in the community colleges. I'm unmarried with no children, and etc. So I would come up with that description. However, if someone were to look at me who didn't know me, how do you think someone would describe me? Or how do you think someone would describe you? So think about that for just a second, because it's going to be they're going to look at you, they're going to see something, and they're going to immediately come to an idea of who you might be. They're going to fill in the gaps. They're going to fill in categories. So if you think about this list here of 6-dimensional person category generator, I call it, and you can define a person's race, their religion, their age, their nationality, their sex or gender, and their occupation. Let's just say that we just say we're going to use those 6 categories. Okay. And let's put some things that we could choose as to how we would pick a category, and then in our minds visualize what that person might look like. Okay. So if I said white, male, middle-aged, Christian, Detroit factory worker, some of us who have never even been in Detroit, have never had any exposure to what a factory worker would look like. How many of you could not come up with an image? I mean, you would come up with an image in your mind because you've seen newspapers and movies and TV shows, that give you an idea of what this person would look like, and you put them in that category, right? Because we've had that exposure. However, if I said Black, Muslim, 60-ish, French, lesbian professor, What would that look like to you? We would all have very, very different ideas based upon what we've been exposed to. We fill in those categories of what this person might look like, where you might run into them, etc. We fill in the categories. Our brain does that automatically. So here's a question. If I, you know, if someone, say you hear a news story or whatever, and it said that someone was described as simply as American, what do you see? What image immediately comes to mind? For most of it's a white male adult, right? So that's how our minds work. So let's go through really quickly some of these pictures right here. What does, you know, you look at a picture of this young black man, and let's say you wanted to put him in those categories of what do you think of this, is who this person might be, you know? Let's think about, you know, just real quick, because one of the things about biases you don't think about, they come right up. Okay. This is a picture of Alex Rios. He's a Puerto Rican professional baseball player. Did any of you come up with baseball player? No. What about this gentleman? What did he come up with? Professor, actor. This is Walter Becker. He was half of the Steely Dan trio. I love, they're my favorite, and he passed away last year. This woman looks kind of like she might be in my category, right? Not quite, way out of my league. This is Lillian Lambert. She's the first African-American woman to graduate from Harvard Business School. And she's now a very successful businesswoman, and she's a writer, speaker. This young lady, this is Sarai. She's a rapper. So I wanted to get you to see how we leap above and leap ahead and fill in information about people. And we do that with our students too. We can create an image from and an idea about who a person may be with only a couple of pieces of information. By default of either our upbringing, what we see in newspapers and televisions, what we hear people talk about, we use all of that. Our brain stores all of that information and just fills it in for us. Right? So counteracting implicit bias is, you know, is challenging. When we recognize it, we lack the courage to go there. You know, a lot of you are hearing about the book by I'm blanking on her name, White Fragility, Robin DiAngelo. This is what this is about. People don't want to go there. You want to talk about racism, but there's denial. You know, so one of the things I want to really bring out here is that counteracting implicit bias takes very challenging and difficult conversations. And we must begin to do those. We got to get people to go there, go in and become more aware, face that we all have it, and begin to talk about how we can start to go in and take a look at how we start to become more aware of it, because it's going to take, it takes a lot of time. It's like changing culture. You can't change culture overnight. So neither can you change yourself overnight. But you got to do it, because if we don't recognize it, if we don't look in at what our biases may be, we're just going to be stuck in that autopilot mode and things will not change. I want to share a little bit a story about my own encounter with unconscious bias. In my mid-20s, I took my first trip out of the country, barely out of the country, but to the Bahamas. But I was not aware that I just knew Bahamas was this wonderful Caribbean island, and I was going there on vacation. When I didn't realize that the Bahamas was a Black nation country. So when I got on the when I after I got to Miami, got off of the American airline flight and got on the Bahamas air flight, got on the plane and saw that the entire crew was Black. My first feeling was one of unsafe. I was unsafe. That a Black pilot was not as good as a white pilot. It was really interesting. And then when I landed at the airport in Nassau and saw this efficient, well-run, functioning, everybody there was Black. My heart sank. The good thing was that I asked myself, wow, how could you even think that about your own people? How could you think that a country couldn't be run by Black people? I was 26. So I began to question that. I went back and I started to look at, how I grew up and what I heard when I was growing up, that, that a white doctor is going to be better than a Black doctor, that I could go to a store in the white neighborhood and get better things that I could get in the Black neighborhood. So you can see how unconscious bias is part, and even racial unconscious bias is human. And I think that's the opportunity that we have with our students to also help them see how some of the beliefs about themselves the beliefs they have about themselves are wrong. That they've been indoctrinated into their heads. They've been accepted as how it is. They've been categories of their mind and the way that they think about things have had an influence on their success and their ability to be to persist in school. And we certainly have an opportunity to deal with that. So you cannot, how do you remove this blindfolded bias? Well, you can't you can't suppress biases. You can't push them away. Because that just requires too much mental effort. So what you have to do is to, challenge yourself, be aware of it, become conscious of it, catch yourself in these beliefs when they pop up. You have to think about how do I deal with that? And like I said, you have to have those difficult conversations and be willing to go there. And you also have to remember, one of the things that I bring forth and bring out, not only in when I'm having these conversations and doing these presentations in the work environment, but as well as in the, in our environment, in our, the high schools and community colleges, that for many people, the classroom and the workplace is the only place they experience real diversity. All of us come to work, we come to classes from the communities in which we live. And unfortunately, a lot of folk that are coming to work or coming to school are coming from communities where most of the people look like them. Whether it's white and affluent, or mostly people of color and less affluent. but they're coming from an environment and into a diverse environment and interacting with different people from different cultures. And that is an opportunity if we create an environment where everybody feels welcome and they can get to know each other and begin to accept our differences and what I call cultural humility. I don't believe in cultural fluency. I don't believe, unless you go and you immerse yourself in that culture for months and years. So when people talk about being culturally competent and culturally, fluent, not unless you go into that culture and stay there. But you can let go of your ethnocentric views of things and realize that you are naive about other cultures, other people, their experience, where they come from, what their biases may be. And you have to be open and willing to be curious about people. That is the key thing. Curiosity about the perspectives and experiences of others. So this would be kind of the segue into the rest of the part of this work. But one of the things I just want to bring out, if you're asking about, how do you counteract our unconscious bias? And it has to start with critical self-reflection. In other words, self-awareness. In the conversations that we're having at the region, I call it facing systemic racism. You can't, you really can't go in and really, really dive into it to understand it unless you first become more aware of yourself, your own self-awareness and how you're showing up and bringing who you are. And it takes cultural humility, what I call perspective taking, and that all is based on empathy. I mean, that's one of the things we're hearing a lot in the discourse today is a lack of empathy in our country right now, but that's what it's going to take. And we all have the ability to do that because we're human beings and we're social. And if we would go there and have those conversations, that would be the beginning of starting to make some change.